This episode is made possible by Storyblocks. I gotta be honest, I don't even know why I'm making this video. Elon Musk already solved world hunger last year. You remember, he had that viral tweet where he said he'd donate $6 billion if anyone could tell him how it would work. Then someone actually did tell him how, and figured out that $6 billion, while not ending world hunger, would save a whopping 42 million people on the brink of starvation, roughly the population of Spain. And then Musk freaked out and asked for more details, and completely coincidentally stopped tweeting about it immediately once those details were actually produced, and it started to look like he would actually have to follow through on something for once, instead of being a little clout goblin trying to cover up whatever horrible thing he did that week. But then, instead of following through, he donated those $6 billion to an anonymous charity, while the organization that was going to, let me remind you, save 42 million people got nothing. Oh, and then it turned out that the whole thing was probably just a tax avoidance scheme. Wait, did I say Musk already solved world hunger? My bad, I got confused. The thing is that in theory, everyone wants to solve world hunger. It's a massive 829 million people-sized problem. That's roughly 10% of everyone alive right now. Just to put that in perspective, if you put all those people in the largest stadium in the US, Michigan Stadium, they'd spill out everywhere and be upset with you. But in all seriousness, the numbers are genuinely alarming. Each and every day, around 25,000 people die of starvation, and it's estimated that half of all deaths in children under 5, 3.1 million deaths a year, are caused by a lack of basic nutrients. And tragically, it's not just that the numbers of this global disaster are awful. In recent years, they've actually started going up. Several countries in particular, like Yemen, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, are currently facing brutal famines. Here in the US, food insecurity affects at least 38 million people and around 8% of children. The problem with these ghastly statistics is that there's no good reason for them to be so dire. We actually have enough food for everyone. By some estimates, we currently produce enough to feed 10 billion people. Not only more than the roughly 7.8 billion people on the planet right now, but enough for the extreme estimate of what the global population might get to at some point in the future. In other words, we don't have a food production problem. What we really have is a problem of how we treat food, and that is as a commodity. The first place we need to start looking for solutions to world hunger is in food waste, and how that relates to the commodification of food. Around 1/3 of the food we produce globally never gets eaten, which is equal to about 1.3 billion tons of waste every year. While we're often told that this is a consumer problem, something we're doing wrong at home, if we just steal this graphic from the very talented Our Changing Climate, we can see that waste isn't just happening in this final stage, but rather all along the supply chain. Let's start at the farm. Around 16% of the food that is produced gets wasted right at the beginning. Part of that is unavoidable, but a lot of it can be explained by just a few ridiculous facts. The first is that farmers leave a tremendous amount of food to rot in the ground. In total, about 34% of the food grown according to at least one study. That's not because that food is bad. It's the same as all the other food they've grown. It's because of something really dumb. Market prices dropping over the course of a single growing season. Between early season and late season, the value of produce just declines in response to things like an increase in the supply. These lower prices make hiring the labor required to pull the food from the ground too expensive, since it no longer delivers enough of a profit. Therefore, farmers can't afford the final step of the farming process and are even incentivized to artificially limit the supply of food to raise the price back up, which they do by letting it literally rot. In both cases, whether it's not being able to afford labor or playing the supply and demand game, it's prices that put farmers in an uncomfortable position. All the time, effort, and resources that went into growing the food, doing the hard part of making the things we eat, goes to waste not because it is no longer needed, as we know from how many people are food insecure, but because price fluctuations make it no longer profitable. It's absurd. During the pandemic, we saw just how bad this can get when farmers dumped literal truckloads of milk and destroyed entire fields of crops at the same time as Americans experienced one of the most sudden food shortages in living memory. You probably remember that food banks had lines around the block. People needed food and the food was there for the taking, but an economic crash suddenly made it unprofitable to provide it, so it was destroyed. It's like if you did all the work to buy, I don't know, random example, a social media company, and then tried to pull out at the last second after the stock price had dropped because you're not a very good businessman. Except somehow, food waste isn't nearly as silly as something like that. We're talking about how people get fed here.
Okay, Okay, let's see my to-do list. Go to work, go to work, go to work, go to work, go to work.
Those are the first visible problems with subjecting food to market pressures. And then there's all the food that's thrown out because it's not pretty enough. Farmers know that in order to fetch the highest prices from their buyers, and their buyers from individual consumers in turn, they need to discard produce that has any blemishes, bruises, or aesthetic flaws. Here again, we see the issue with treating food like a commodity with the standards of industrial production. A lot of food gets wasted not because it's inedible or unsafe, but because it's not competitive enough. A notion that's hard to even wrap your head around when what we're talking about here is a zucchini. The zucchini isn't competing hard enough. Think about that for a second. Interestingly, you might think that this is actually a case where the market has come up with a solution to this problem. In the last few years, we've seen a sudden explosion in at-home delivery of quote-unquote ugly produce with brands like Imperfect Foods or Misfit Markets. These brands have capitalized on this growing knowledge about food waste, and seem to be doing something good about it. But unfortunately, a closer look into these companies reveals that their business model isn't actually solving this problem. What these brands actually do is outbid food banks and other food service organizations and snatch up the slightly uglier produce for cheap in order to sell it for more directly to consumers. In other words, ugly food at home delivery diverts produce that wasn't going to be wasted away from those in need. Meaning we still have an ugly food problem, but now it's also hurting food banks. Continuing along the food supply chain, the next important place that food gets wasted is in grocery stores. Here, food gets wasted in two big ways. The first is because grocery stores rely on the illusion of abundance as a selling tool. The apple at the top of a glossy red pyramid built with the decaying flesh of its brothers is more appealing to us than the last apple in the box, decaying all on its own like a sad little loner. We're reluctant to buy the last piece of produce because we assume something is wrong with it, instead of the more reasonable conclusion that it just happens to be the only one left. So grocery stores make sure it never gets to that point. Grocery stores are more motivated by sales than by reducing waste, meaning they'll overbuy to use produce as nothing more than window dressing, knowing full well that a big chunk of what they've bought will just go in the trash. And let's talk about just how much goes in the trash. That's point number 2. You've probably seen these clips of grocery store dumpsters filled to the brim with food. Perfect, beautiful, often completely sealed in a pristine plastic package, ready-to-eat food. You've probably also seen that sometimes these stockpiles will get locked, drenched in bleach, or even guarded by police. Here again, we see the problem of food being treated as a commodity. Grocery stores hold on to food until the very last second they can sell it, something that's usually determined by an expiration date that isn't standardized or regulated in most places in the US, and that producers not only determine on their own most of the time, but have an incentive to undershoot as much as possible so stores will restock faster and buy more. For grocery stores, the minute the food is no longer a product in their eyes, regardless of how good the food inside the packaging is, it is immediately considered waste. It is useless to the grocery store, so it makes no difference if it gets destroyed. Without a way to treat food humanely, without a network in place that can properly use the food while it's good instead of only treating the food as something that absolutely needs to be bought and sold, the atomized units of the farm, the grocery store, and the consumer each respond to their own incentives, rather than work together with a collective interest of feeding everyone and not wasting the food that took so much effort to produce. Everyone is just trying to maximize their profits and/or minimize their costs, even when that means throwing perfectly good food away. When you look online to try to find an explanation for why in the world this food gets bleached or guarded by apparently heartless people with guns, the one you'll usually find is because it could become a liability for grocery stores if someone gets poisoned and they decide to sue. While this explanation makes some sense, there's no clear evidence it's the motivation behind bleaching dumpsters, and yet it nonetheless reveals our structural problem. As a unit looking out only for its monetary self-interest, the grocery store can only treat food, and by extension potential lawsuits, as economic inputs, as numbers that need to be balanced out by maximizing sales and minimizing costs. This precludes it from feeding people who need to be fed because feeding for free brings in no money, and if they sue, could theoretically even cost money. There is no overarching structure that handles food distribution, only prices. And that means destroying food is fine so long as it doesn't cost anyone money. This logic of prioritizing profits is also why nearly 40 million Americans live in food deserts. While we can talk about grocery store waste for hours on end, the absence of grocery stores is also a problem. If this is your first time hearing the term, food deserts are places where food is especially difficult to access, especially fresh produce. And it's a distinction typically determined by the distance and available transportation between households and grocers. Unlike what the term food desert implies, however, these are not natural phenomena. Food deserts are the product of decisions made by governments and business owners. They're places usually where poorer Americans live, and therefore places where setting up a grocery store or some sort of public transportation system to get to a grocery store is less profitable. Not less necessary, just less profitable. Putting a Whole Foods somewhere only a few people will afford it makes less fiscal sense than building a second one in a wealthy neighborhood, even though the food supply is already abundant. Altogether, the incentives that appear at the farm and at the grocery store, or at the place where the grocery store should have been, means that a lot of food never makes it into our hands. And that is a big part of the reason we have a global hunger problem. But the final stage of the food supply chain is where most of the food waste tends to happen. Once we've bought the food and it's on our plate, there's a good chance it won't make the short journey up to the biggest of our faceholes. Awareness of this fact has been growing in the past few decades, with public messaging campaigns emphasizing our need to waste less, and using many of the same statistics you've seen in this video. A similarity of a lot of these anti-waste campaigns, though, is their focus on guilting people, shaming those who don't eat all the food they buy, which is to say, all of us, telling us it is our fault that so much food is being wasted. And while it is true that we can make an effort to waste less and should be aware of how much of what we buy goes in the trash, pinning this problem on the individual is a clever way to try to avoid a more systemic question. Like with climate change, the blame for very big problems is often pinned on atomized individuals because it takes the blame off a system that is measurably more at fault. As I explained in this video, consumer decisions are made within a context that facilitates and often outright necessitates hurting the environment. In these campaigns, we can see how the same goes for food waste. We live in a world built for overconsumption, and therefore for food waste. Since the 1960s and 70s, supermarkets have stocked 10 times more large-sized food products. Plates have increased 36% in size. Refrigerators have gotten 30% bigger and cost half as much. Entire companies like Costco have popped up to sell food in excessive bulk. And we are, of course, under a constant barrage of ads inciting us to consume more. And it's not just that there's tremendous pressure to purchase more and subtle nudges that make reasonable consumption seem like it's too little. It's often simply cheaper to overbuy and waste than to buy in appropriate quantities. 2-for-1 deals and now with 30% more slogans on our shredded cheese bags make that clear. Virtually everything is pushing us towards overconsumption. It's simply not enough to resist these pressures at the individual level. Not only does this individualistic approach fail to recognize the incredible amount of money poured into advertising and marketing to achieve this specific goal, at the end of the day, it leaves intact a system that incentivizes producers to target some of us for overconsumption, while leaving others out to dry. Individual action isn't the problem, the drive to always increase profits is. Up until now, this video has been focused on what hunger looks like in one country, the US. Although we can easily find parallels to what's happening here in many other individual countries, there are forces that make hunger a more global problem. And to understand those, we have to go back a few years when the modern global capitalist economy was entering its present form. Starting in the late 70s and 80s, two international institutions led by Western countries, the IMF and the World Bank, started going around the world and offering resource-rich but money-poor countries a deal. These institutions told countries that if they wanted to be a part of the international economy, and maybe get a loan to get them started, they would have to make certain economic adjustments to fit in with the big boys. In simple terms, simple because the little red bar is about to hit the rightmost wall of the YouTube video and then I stop existing, countries had to open up their economies to international competition. They had to invite international companies to buy up and control their natural resources, privatize their domestic industries, and generally speaking, let the free market do its thing. As you might expect, entering a global competition in which wealthy countries have a big leg up and you're told to let the market do whatever it wants with little to no intervention meant that plenty of countries entered into an exploitative relationship with the wealthy countries of the global north. These wealthy countries, better off after centuries of robbing the rest of the world, used these deals to siphon off natural resources from developing countries. They then used these natural resources, process them, and sell back the processed products to developing nations at a higher cost. In agriculture, this has meant small-scale farmers in the global south who have little to no state investment because of the adjustments to their economies made in the 80s, technological setbacks, and in some cases less hospitable environments, are asked to compete with European and American farmers who by contrast benefit from protectionist tariffs, heavy state subsidies, and access to more productive technology. Simply put, wealthy countries can bring the prices down on their crops where others can't, except by lowering wages. In practice, this makes farmers in the global south poorer and less able to buy the processed food they need. They can't feed themselves with the crops they grow since those are destined for export. This means Western countries, sometimes disappointingly joined by China, have effectively killed the autonomous agricultural capacity of entire continents over decades. And now that that's done, have moved in to replace it with their own. Western and Chinese companies move in and set up their own agribusiness to divert food produced in Africa out of the continent. A lot of the hunger that we see in the world today is explained by the fact that a forced dependency has been created between the wealthy and the poor, that entire countries can no longer autonomously produce their own food despite it often growing within their own borders. The process has gotten so ridiculous that in Gambia, wild, hand-caught fish is being processed by foreign-owned factories into a fine powder that gets exported to feed farm-raised fish. Wild fish are being caught to feed farmed fish. As a result, the bonga, a fish that used to be so abundant that it was distributed freely, has gone missing from Gambian diets. The bonga has been overfished, the local environment has been incredibly damaged, and locals are facing food insecurity because the profits of this industry do not end up in their hands and the farm-raised fish is too expensive. What we see in all these examples is an inhumane way to produce and distribute food. At the core of the world hunger problem is the reality that you can't make money when something's abundant. Scarcity is the name of the capitalist game, and capitalism is currently the only force organizing our food production and distribution. The abolition of scarcity, aka feeding everyone, isn't compatible with this system. So long as that's true, so long as capitalism is allowed to survive, we have no hope of solving world hunger. Over the years, I've had a lot of people ask me how I make my videos. Particularly, they want to know where I get all my footage. The answer is Storyblocks. Storyblocks is one of the most well-known platforms for sourcing royalty-free assets like stock footage, After Effects templates, music, images, and sound effects. For people like me who need to cover a lot of material but don't have the budget of Hollywood films or big production houses, being able to lean on Storyblocks and their massive library of content is a game changer. It allows me to make the videos I want to make without sacrificing my vision due to time, budget, or resource constraints. If I'm being perfectly honest, there's no way I could make my videos without Storyblocks and the footage they provide. I use a ton of stock footage in my videos, so I'm constantly downloading shots from Storyblocks. And the best part is, the vast majority of their catalog doesn't scream stock footage like a lot of other sites. Their footage is high quality, professional, and covers just about every topic you could ever need, from aerials to city life to professions, manufacturing, and more. And if you do happen to want a meme shot, they have those too. If you're looking to get started making videos like mine, I highly recommend you give Storyblocks a try. They've got flexible subscription plans for every budget. And if you're like me and you need literally hours of stock footage, their unlimited all-access plan gives you the freedom to download and use as many assets as you want. So if you'd like to help support my channel and get access to one of my absolute favorite video production resources, visit storyblocks.com/secondthought and give it a try today. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous content by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.